as you see it in your sort of daily life, particularly focusing on the election in whatever many days left it is. It's all a blur at this point, right? But in the few weeks that are left here, as you're well, if you're like me, right, we're all sort of anxious about what the outcome is going to be, and polls sometimes, in theory, can help us mitigate some of that uncertainty. And so we tend to a lot of us tend to gravitate towards them. Um, so to talk a little bit about polling, really, there's not a sort of single way that we do it. That we've been doing this for a long time. So, the history of polling really goes back to 1824, or at least the attempts to try to figure out what voters were thinking in an election are about 200 years old now. The classic model of how this is supposed to work is that we have some population that we're interested in. Either it's Iowans or Americans or voters or whatever this population of people that we are interested in. The classic model of polling is if you draw a random sample from that population, you can use that sample to infer things about the population. In terms of, election polls, you can infer what is our best estimate of the state of the race, of the standing of the two major party candidates in the population based on a relatively small sample. But we also get an estimate of how good that estimate is. We get an estimate of how certain we should be about that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And that's the sort of idea behind polling. When polling works perfect, that's how it's supposed to work, right? The math, the stats, the logic of it is all based on that model. And it's not a model we actually use anymore for a variety of reasons that I'll talk about. So we've been, like I said, people have wanted to know the outcome of elections ever since we've been holding elections. In American presidential history, really the first election that was seriously contested as an electoral event and not sort of a decision making of elites and our founders was the election of 1824, one of the first Andrew Jackson election. And this was a time where that elections changed a lot. It's sort of Jackson actually campaigned for president in ways that hadn't been done before. He was an outsider trying to bring in new voters and to open up the system in a variety of ways. And people wanted to know what was going to happen. And so they did their best. And the best way that we could do this in 1824 was to just ask people who they were supporting. But we didn't have the machinery or the know-how to do it correctly. So often what we would do, or what people would do, is go to taverns and ask, hey, everyone, who are you voting for? Or they would go to local militia offices. They'd show up at public meetings and just sort of ask people and sort of count up how many people are voting for each of the candidates. And you can imagine, that's the best they could do, and it was a poor job of it, right? This is one of these public meetings. No offense, you are not a representative audience of let's say people and names, right? There's some from my there's some obvious differences, and as my day job as a teaching classes, right? You don't look like my students very much. So right, this didn't work very well, but it was the best we could do, and that's one of the things I want to return to, which is the best we can do, because we're always in doing this doing the best we can. So we used these techniques for a long time. And in the early 1900s, there was a magazine known as Literary Digest, which has sort of been lost to time, except for this one stylized fact about Literary Digest, which is they would include in the magazine a poll. Essentially, they would ask their subscribers who they were going to vote for. And Literary Digest was a really, really popular magazine. And so from 1912 to 1932, it actually did a pretty good job, right, of just asking who was going to vote. It had a problem in 1936, right? So 1936 is the second Franklin Roosevelt election, right? It's the first time he runs for re-election. The Literary Digest poll came back and said that Alf Landon of Kansas was going to win handily in 1936. There was no Landon presidencies because they were off. They were off by a little bit. They were off by 39 points. In the margin of victory between Roosevelt's actual margin and the margin they forecast. And that's a problem. And they tried to figure out what went wrong. And they realized that this wasn't a question of sample size, right? We might want to think, well, maybe they only didn't ask that many people, and so it's hard to sort of generalize. They asked, they had a subscription rate of 10 million, and they asked all 10 million, and 2.4 million people participated in the poll. That's a lot of people. But the problem is that the respondents were not a random sample of Americans, but also they weren't a representative sample of Americans, that they differed in some pretty systematic ways. So the way they did it in 1936 was to ask their readers. So this is, 7 years into the Great Depression. The people who could afford to subscribe to magazines in 1936 did not look like the people who could not afford to subscribe to magazines. But they knew that, well, maybe it's not just our readers, maybe we should ask other people. And so they did what they could. They got the registry of people who owned cars in America and sent out a mailer to everyone who owned a car in 1936. And they got the phone book, basically, and got the phone list of telephone users in 1936. Now, phones become a key part of polling later, but in 1936, that technology was expensive, and it was not that widespread. And so the people that they asked, the 2.4 million people who took their poll, just didn't look like everyone else. And so they were systematically off. It also was the fact that even the people that they talked to or reached out to and communicated with, there was a different problem, which is it ends up the people who were pissed off at Franklin Roosevelt were more motivated to answer the poll than the people who were supportive of Franklin Roosevelt. So it isn't even just they were reaching out to wealthier people. They were asking this group of people to do stuff, and people's motivations were different based on were they supporting Landon and Roosevelt. Literary Digest had built a reputation on this poll, and this killed the magazine, basically, and it sort of lost to history. But in 1936, there was a different attempt going on. George Gallup, son of Iowa, George Gallup was working on the same problem of how do we do this, and he realized that this was a terrible approach, and he relied on what was sort of developing statistical theory at the time about sampling, right? So the idea, again, like I said, the idea of a poll is you take a sample, a subset of the population, and you can infer. That idea, that math behind that is true no matter what you are sampling. So my wife is a biologist. She's a prairie ecologist who studies fields. And in the fields, she divides the fields up geographically and randomly samples in that to infer something about the field that she is studying. It's the same math and intuition and statistics that goes into the sampling that goes on in polls. If we know a population, we only have to study a random sample of it to infer, and we can do a pretty good job of that. So Gallup is the one who takes this idea and starts applying it to people. And so he develops a random sampling technique or a purposeful sampling technique to be able to do this. And he gets 1936 right. So at the time, we get this famous poll of Literary Digest that everyone pays attention to that's off by a ton. And then there's this Iowa guy, Gallup, who's doing it right and getting it right. And Gallup continues, and he builds a company out of this. It still exists today, right? I'm actually in the sample for the Gallup polls. I'll talk about more of that in a minute. But it continues on to this day, and it's the sort of standard. It's the industry benchmark. It's the Xerox, right, of polling. He ended up getting 1948 wrong. He gets 36, 40, and 44 right, and he gets 1948 wrong. And for you students of history, that's the Dewey defeats Truman election, right, where Truman's holding it up. And he did what every pollster would do, is to try to figure out what went wrong. And he figures out what went wrong was he stopped polling too soon. That the polling that he did was probably accurate, but he'd stopped far enough back from the election that the story for the 48 election is a lot of people made up their mind at the last minute, and they all sort of went to Truman. And that's why he was able to outperform. And so the lesson was, don't trust polls that are... Don't assume that polls that are a couple of weeks out or a month out from the election are going to actually forecast the election itself, right? Instead, right, keep polling until the last minute. So Gallup himself is largely responsible for the development of the entire industry. So again, how we do this is we start with identifying the population we're interested in. Somebody was trying to put their bike up. So that's what the banging was. So you define a target population. What are you interested in, right? Are you interested in the national vote margin? Are you interested in the vote margin in Iowa? Are you interested in Pennsylvania, right? You define what it is that you're trying to sample from, right? One of the things you have to think about is when we're doing election polling, we're interested in voters. right? If we're trying to figure out who's going to win the election or who's ahead or who's behind, we have to only think about people who are going to vote. If we're interested in like presidential approval, what proportion of the country approve of the job Joe Biden is doing, there we want everybody. But for election polling, you really only want voters. And that's really hard. There's not a list of who's going to vote yet, right? There's after the fact there is, but because your vote is public, right? The state has a record of everyone who votes. But before the end, we don't know who it is. So we got to deal with that. But once you deal with that, you ideally want to take a random sample from it. You identify this and you select people totally at random. Historically, as we moved to phone polling, right? So when Gallup developed the industry as it evolved, phones became ubiquitous. And so the way you would sample is either you would just literally random digit dial, right? So you would dial at random. I did some polling for someone when I was in grad school. And what we did is we randomly chose pages of the phone book, picked the first phone number on the page, and changed the last digit up by 1. Right, so we're area code, prefix, and then just change, and we're just choosing people at random from that, right? The other thing you can do is if you're going to do phone polling in Iowa, you can contact the Secretary of State and you can buy the list of every registered voter in the state. And on that registration, everyone lists a phone number. It's part of your voter registration. And you can take that giant list and you can randomly sample from it, right? You use a random number generator just to pick people at random. So I've done that with some of the polling I've done in the past as well. So again, the idea for why this works is what's known as the central limit theorem, is the math and stats behind this. Assume we have a population, we have the public, right? We have whatever set of people in it. And there's something we want to know about that. We want to know the average age, or we want to know the average income, or the average height, or their vote choice, right? If you want to figure out what is our best estimate of the average of any of those things, the proportion of people voting for a candidate is a one way to think about the average. A truly random sample that if you can draw at random and make everyone you draw answer your question, then you will have then the math and the stat theory works like a charm, right? It is a mathematical theorem that does this. It is true by definition. What's the two parts of it that are true is that the sample mean, right? So if I take a random sample of people, I ask them their height. If I take the average height in my sample, that is an unbiased estimate of the average height of the population. So it's not going to overestimate and say I'm an inch too high. It's not going to underestimate consistently and say I'm an inch too low. It will be an unbiased estimate of the mean of the population. I can also, with some math, and I'm not going to talk through the math, but with some math, I can estimate how accurate an estimate is that. And I can calculate the uncertainty I have. I talk with my hands, so I got to be careful on the mic, right? The uncertainty I have with that. And I can know that the true population mean is within a certain range 95% of the time. Right. This is in polling, we refer to this as a margin of error, is what we end up calculating. And the central limit theorem and the math behind this is true, right? It is a mathematical theorem that is precisely true as a theorem. But the key piece to it is that random sample, right? That it is a random sample, and the people I interview have to be a random sample. So not the people I select, but the people who actually answer my question have to be a random sample for the central limit theorem to work properly. So again, this is just mathematically true, like I said. And so this worked pretty well for a while. And it worked for a while, I mean like 50 years, right? For decades, this worked pretty well because we could random digit dial or we could sample from a phone list. Everybody had a phone. There were some biases in who would answer, but the biases weren't that bad, right? In 1984, people still answered the phone, right? That's pre-caller ID, pre-cell phone. People actually answered the phone and took surveys. The thing is, right, if everybody answers, or if the people who don't answer are themselves random, right? So it's just everyone decides with a coin flip on whether or not I'm going to take the poll, you're still fine. What gets to be a problem is when the people who choose not to participate or cannot be contacted are non-random. Say they systematically vote for one candidate or the other, then you start running into trouble. And like I said, this worked well for decades. Everyone had a poll, everyone had a landline, or everyone had a phone, everyone had a landline, right? Responses ended up not being too biased. There were some, but they weren't that bad. And we could do things like random digit dialing. And the other thing is that we can know when there are biases in these things, because this is the other trick to polling, is we know the truth for some things. Because of the US Census, we know how many people in Iowa have a college degree. We know how many people in Iowa are white. We know the age breakdown of Iowa. We know the gender breakdown of Iowa. We know the combination of all of those things. We know how many white 50-year-old men with a college degree live in the 4th district in Iowa. And so what we can do is we can look at our data and we can say, oh, right, that half of Iowa are men, half of Iowa are women. We've got this survey and it's 60-40. That's a problem. But we know we can identify the problem because of the census data. We know what the population actually looks like, and we can adjust. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Phone polling broke because the industry changed. Cell phones created a problem. Right. So initially phone polling would work well when area codes were area. Like I talked to my students about this and I'm like, do you understand why an area code is called an area code? And they don't get it. Like, no, this used to tie you to a specific geographic place, right? 3-digit phone prefixes used to tie you to specific places as well, right? And so you could geo-target where you're calling based on those first 6 digits. Well, we didn't need to use area code sometimes too, right? Back. But right, we could geo-target in that way. Caller ID killed polling, right? When you know who calls, nobody answers those calls, right? Right? And that sort of hurt the model. It broke the model of the industry. And then the federal government got involved as well. So as cell phones and phone technology expanded, telemarketers took over, right? And so telemarketers got involved and started making all those annoying phone calls to us. And we all hated them. We all complained. And the federal government did something about it. So there's all sorts of federal regulations about auto calling, right? A machine dials for you, that were the backbone of the polling industry that broke it, right? Phone polls, actual polls, are exempt from a lot of the telemarketing laws, but a lot of the laws themselves are tied to specific types of technology, and that technology the polls used. You cannot get on a no-call list for pollsters. They're actually exempted from this in the same way that you can from telemarketers, but they can't use the same kind of technology for dialing, and so it got a lot more expensive for them to run this. One of the other things that also hurt is that it actually became a lot easier to do polling and a lot cheaper to do polling. And so lots and lots and lots of firms popped up to do this. Right? There was a massive polling industry in this country. I take polls in part because I'm interested in them. I'm in a couple of different panels for polls. I'll talk about that in just a second. About 2 out of 3 polls I get are about marketing. Right. So industries want to know about their brand. Industries want to know if their messaging is getting through. And that's the backbone of polling in America. That's where the money is in polling, because brands will use this data for their marketing, and they have so much money behind that this props up the industry. So it's a lucrative industry where political polling is a side hustle, essentially, for them, right? The marketing industry is what really drives it. But that proliferation meant there were more and more calls coming, right? That we were getting more of these things. And, we kind of, it's one thing if it's Gallup, right? We've heard of Gallup. Or I know some folks in Iowa get sort of excited when Ann Seltzer calls for the Iowa poll, right? And like, oh, hey, I'm in the Des Moines Register, I'm in the Iowa poll. Excellent. That's a big deal. But when some company you've never heard of is claiming to be polling, that sort of sets off your spidey sense. And you think, is this real? Is this legit? And so as more and more firms develop, more and more people become skeptical of the entire thing. And people are getting called more, they're getting annoyed more, and response rates go way down. So what ends up happening from that is that the industry shifts. Because again, polling is an industry, right? It is a massive industry in this country. And as the model that the industry was working on broke, they adapted. So this is a figure that Pew produced, which is out of leading poll firms that do political. They were interested in political polling. Pew was. This is the percentage of the industry that changed something about their methodology, right? And the way to look at it is in 2000 and 2004, right on the far left, basically 4% of polling firms did anything different from the previous cycle, right? Things were working. Nobody was too concerned about it, so they didn't change. As we've moved on, particularly as we hit 2012, a full third of the industry changes. How the firms don't change. The same firm changes their methodology every time, right? So some of that is cell phones, right? Some of that is learning from the mistakes in 2016. Some of that is new technology coming online. They are constantly adapting how they do this. Now, I've besmirched some parts of the industry, but for the most part, pollsters are trying to get it right? That they survive on their reputation of accuracy. And so when there is a problem, they try to fix it. When Gallup realized he got 1948 wrong because he stopped polling too soon, he fixed it. He kept polling later in the cycle, and lo and behold, in 52 and in 56, he was pretty accurate again. The industry does the same thing. They adapt every time. So I know some people have a folklore view in their mind that pollsters don't call cell phones. Yeah, that hasn't been true in 10, 15 years. Once cell phones became pretty common, they started calling them. So nobody's just landline anymore. Right. This is another way of visualization of how they've changed. So it's from 2020 to 2022. I know it's a little bit of a messy graph, but let me walk you through it. The total space on the y-axis, the height of that, is how many polling firms were out there doing political polling. And so if you just look at the overall figure, it's gone up over time, right? So there are more and more people doing this. The dark blue that is the bottom is live phone, cell phone and landline, random digit dialing. In 2000, that's the industry standard. Now there are 4 of the firms doing that only, right? So nobody does that exclusively anymore. What's taken off is that orange one in the middle, which is online opt-in. I'll talk about what that is in a second. But there's a huge variety of methods now, right? Which is one of the takeaways, is that just about every poll that you see does this differently from every other poll, right? They're all trying different techniques. They all have strengths and weaknesses, and they're all trying to do their best that they can. But they all are going to have a problem. The hope is that they don't all have the same problem, right? So that if one poll is off in one direction, another one's off in a different way, given the technology of how they use this. And like I said, I'll talk about what all the different techniques are in a minute. The other thing that they're doing is that they're using multiple methods. That a lot of the very, very leading pollsters, the best ones, don't just rely on one technique. If you know random digit dialing, live calling has this problem, and this other type of poll has this other problem, why don't you do both, right? And so pollsters are increasingly doing this, and it's really changed also over time, right? So the light blue is just the percentage of polling firms that use one method, and the medium blue is used 2, and the dark blue that only shows up at the top is used 3 or more. So about a fifth of the industry, one survey firm, is using 3 different techniques of doing this and pooling their answers to get the best answer they can. Again, the industry recognizes its problems and it tries to solve them the best they can. So what are these techniques that they're using, right? So phone polling is the sort of classic and standard. Every pollster uses a different technique. Every pollster uses a different approach. And there's really 3 pieces that go into running a poll. The first is, how do they select you? Right? How do they decide to contact you to take the poll? Second, given that they've selected you, how do they contact you to take that specific poll? Sometimes those are linked, but not always. And then third, once they contact you, how do they actually interview you? Right? And every pollster uses a different combination of these things. And I want to talk about each of these steps each of these steps. Right. So like I said, random digit dialing is the sort of classic way we tend to think about it, and almost nobody does that anymore. Some of it is we usually do care about geography. and cell phones, the portability of area codes has broken this, right? So if I wanted to do a survey of Iowans and I did pure random digit dialing, I would get cell phones, right? I'd get, my cell phone's a 515 number. If they're truly random digit dialing, they could call my cell. My son now lives in Minnesota. He still has his 515 area code phone. So if they wanted to do a survey in Minnesota, well, or if they were doing a survey in Iowa, they could potentially call him. And he's not an Iowan anymore. So that the cell phones still don't work super great. If you're doing a national poll, right, if you want to do what's the state of the race nationally, then it's okay. And so a lot of the ones that are doing random digit dialing are doing national polls. The other approaches are address-based sampling or voter registration-based sampling. Voter registration-based sampling is the other one that I've already talked about, which is they go to the Secretary of State's office, they get the list of registered voters. It's 4 Excel files in Iowa. You can't, the data is so big, Excel doesn't like it if you make it one file. And then you randomly select people from that giant file. And then again, they have phone numbers, they have addresses and phone numbers, and you contact people from that. Address-based sampling is similar, except you don't get the voter registration list, you get address lists, right? Which you can get from counties, right? I mean, Story County has all of our addresses. The state has all of our addresses. You can get that list. Polling firms, excuse me, polling firms also partner a lot with marketing firms. So, your credit card company sells all your data to the marketing firms, right? This is how you get all these random mailers in the mail. The polling firms can get access to that data. They can buy that data as well, right? It's an economy. They can all buy that, and then they can just sample based on addresses. If you do the voter registration list, you get registered voters. Sort of by definition, it's in there in the name, which is good for some polling. But in Iowa, we have same-day registration. So if you do voter registration lists, you will not sample anyone who registers day of. If you do address, you're going to get a lot of people who are unregistered voters and unlikely to vote. So there's a trade-off between those if you're interested in political polling. The bottom one is the newest industry standard that exists. And that is, these panels that exist that are opt-in. So the most famous one, the most prominent one is known as YouGov. It's a pollster that advertises widely for people to take polls. You agree to be in their database, and every now and then you get an email from YouGov that says you've been selected to take a poll. And you click a link in the email and it takes you directly to the poll. This is not a random sample, right? This is not a representative sample, but you can fix it. And I'll talk about how to fix it in a minute, right? But this is one of the processes. The newer technique that's being used by some of the best firms are a combination of sampling, either address-based or voter registration-based, and then opt-in. So they reach out, they do a sample of addresses, and they send you a letter in the mail and says, we would like you to take these polls. Here's the link. We'll pay you to take the polls. You don't get paid much, but you get a pittance to do it. I'm in the YouGov panel. I get 100 to 200 YouGov points per survey I take. Well, actually, some of them get up to about 2,000. And if I get 100,000 points, I can cash it in for $100, right? To give you a sense of what I'm paid for. And I get gift cards or whatever. And again, I do it mostly to sort of see what's in there. I do it to see what's in there. And then I have a lot of friends who are political scientists who hire YouGov to run surveys, and then I'm in their data. And that amuses me. So I do it for that, but I get to see what's going on, right? So I get a thing from these every couple of weeks. I'm in the Gallup. Gallup does this now. Gallup does the address-based sampling, and then you opt in. And so I'm in the Gallup sample. So about once a month, I get an email from Gallup asking me a variety of different things. Gallup also does different techniques, but this is one of the pieces they do. There's been a lot more attention to these different techniques for selecting people. So this is this is the next stage, which is contact. I've got my slides slightly out of order. Once you're in, right? Once you're chosen, how do they reach out to you? And so there's a couple of different ways they can do it, right? They can do live phone. They can call you to take the surveys. The middle one up there is this online opt-in, right? No, I'm sorry, this is the comment. Sorry, I was right. This is the how they select you. Live phone via calling you from one of the sampling techniques. The online opt-in, right? More and more of the industry is doing that. The one in the upper right is the probability-based panel, where you combine things. You take a sample based on addresses and you mail the letter to get in. And that's now a quarter of the industry uses that. And then there's some other ones down here. The multi-mode survey is different ways of sending you letters. The lower middle one is texting. It's random digit dialing, except it's random digit texting. I don't know anyone who clicks on links and texts from random things that you probably shouldn't do that. So I'm surprised so many do that. And then there's an interactive voice response, which are the robopolls that are terrible. Okay, once you're selected, then they contact you. And again, the three main ways they contact you is a phone call, an email, or a text. The texts are a little different. I just said don't do that. Nobody clicks on the text. But if you're in one of these panels that you know, and it's a trusted number, you'll get the message and people will actually do it then. But phone call and email are the main ways. But you can get there via the same selection. So you can do address-based sampling or registration-based sampling, and through the mail, and then ask people in other ways. So that how they contact you is a little boring, frankly. The last piece is how do they actually interview you? So they've reached out to you and they say, please take our survey. How do they then record your answer? Some of it's over the phone still. I have a landline, in living in Ames, I get a lot of phone calls for surveys. Some of them are in an app. So YouGov has a phone app that I can take the survey in directly from that. It can be web-based. So if I get the email, I can click the link and it opens my web browser. And there are still some that are in person, where somebody comes to your door. There are a handful of academic surveys that do this. These are long surveys. These are like 2-hour long surveys. And they do a lot of legwork to get you to agree to it, and they pay you pretty well for doing it. But right, that's a pretty rare and pretty exceptional thing. So this is the mechanics of how they do the surveys. And I've told you they don't work, right? I've told you that you don't get a random sample, right? I'm weird, right? I'm weird in these polls. I am not a random sample of this. The opt-in panels that I talked about are not random samples. How do you fix it? And the way you fix it is you focus less on random and focus more on representative. So it no longer is a truly random sample, and so we no longer rely on the math of the central limit theorem. Instead, we have a sample that looks like our population, right? All polls have errors, and some of the polls know the errors, right? Some of the things we know what's missing. Because again, we know features of the target population. We know from the census data. And what you can do is you can benchmark your poll to the census data. So I said before, right, we know, the ratio of men to women in the state is about 50-50. And if you do a poll that's 60-40, what you can do, if it's 60% men in your sample and 40% women, you count the men a little less and you count the women a little more. Right. And in doing so, when you're calculating what proportion of people are, say, going to vote for Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, if you undercount the population that's too big and overcount the population that's too small, and then, you can add them up through that weighting of some people count a little more and some people count a little less. It's a tricky problem. Basically, what you do is you make the proportion in any category that we want match the population. But again, the categories are complicated. Well, there's a lot of categories, right? So we want to know age, race, ethnicity, college educated, gender, what district you live in. Let's just stick with those 6. What we want is the correct proportion of people who are in the intersection of those 6, right? We want to know how many white 50-year-old men with a college degree who are non-Hispanic live in the 4th district of Iowa, and what proportion of the total sample should be, and what proportion is it in our sample of that, each of those intersections. Each time we add one, we double the number of cells, right? The number of things we're working on. And so this is the secret sauce to polling these days, is this weighting. Every firm does it slightly different. I'll actually talk about that in a second. Right. So, I mean, to give you an example, right, if I did a sample of 1,000 respondents, if I knew that the population was 500 people with a college degree and 500 without, it's not, but let's make the math work nice, right? We would want an evenly split number. If we do the survey and we get 550 people with a college degree and 450 people without a college degree, when the true population is 50-50, right, or is evenly split, we have a problem. And particularly if having a college degree is correlated with the thing we're interested in, vote choice, and it is. What we can do is we can weigh them differently. If you take everyone who has a college degree and multiply them by 0.9, and everyone who doesn't have a college degree, so if you take all the people who, and everyone who doesn't and multiply them as about 1.1, that balance will be about 500, right? And so you can get there just by adding a little weight to some and subtracting a little weight from others. But again, all of the cells simultaneously makes the math very, very hard. And so this is the secret sauce that every firm does differently. Every poll weights. Everyone does this, right? Even ones that are supposed to be random, even random digit dialing, good polls will do this because you don't get a truly random sample because not everyone takes the poll. So there was a story in 2016 where they took 4 pollsters and literally gave them the exact same data and said, use your secret sauce weighting math on this and tell us what the vote was going to be in 2016 between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. 5 pollsters, excuse me. And we got a range from the data of Trump up 1 to Clinton up 4. Again, this is the same survey, literally the same data that each of these people is analyzing, and they're getting different things. They're getting different proportion white, different proportion Hispanic, different proportion Black, and a partisan split in this as well, right? So they all do this, even with literally the same data. So even if they did the same technique, the same sampling, the same contact, the same interviewing, the same everything, that weighting is going to get a pretty sizable range across pollsters. So one of the other problems we've got, which I mentioned in passing, which I'll just touch on right now, is to keep in mind, if we're thinking about who's going to win the presidential election, we don't care about non-voters, right? We just don't. They don't vote, they don't count. And that's the other problem we have in political polling, is that we don't know who's going to vote. And so you have to figure out a way to do that. And pollsters differ. Some pollsters model it. They ask you a string of questions, or they know your voter history from the voter rolls, and they build a mathematical model of your propensity of voting, and that's how they do. Others, Ann Seltzer at the Iowa poll, just asks. The first question of the poll is, are you going to vote? And if you say yes, she trusts you. If you say no, she trusts you, and she moves from there. But that also gets some pretty sizable differences because people lie about voting. People are actually pretty bad about lying. And we know that, right? Because whether or not you vote is public information. And so some pollsters after the fact will check. If you say, particularly they survey you afterwards and say, who'd you vote for? And you say, oh yeah, I voted for X. And they'll be like, no, you didn't. You didn't vote. And so it's really expensive to do that, but they'll do it just to sort of get an estimate of how many people lie. So the end point to all of this is, and I've talked about a couple of examples of pollster. Well, let me go back, right? So we've got these differences. Which one's right? How accurate are any of these? That's the sort of ultimate question, right? Is how accurate are these polls? And I've talked about a couple of classic examples of Gallup in 46, or 48, the Literary Digest. And I think for those of us who paid attention to politics in the last, 8 years, the searing memory from 2016 is how off the polls were, right? The confidence that people had, that I had, that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And obviously she didn't, right? And we've been sort of stuck in this, the polls are inaccurate. And this is a figure of essentially what is the average poll error in which direction for every presidential election. In this context, 16 and 20 don't actually look that bad, right? The 1996 election had a larger error. But if you remember 96, that was Clinton-Dole. That was a Clinton re-election. Clinton won handily. The polls were way off. But they said Clinton was going to win handily, and Clinton won sort of handily. Nobody cared, right? Nobody was hand-wringing over this, the fact that it was, 6 points or whatever off in 1996, because they got the answer of who won right. Part of the legacy of 2016 isn't how far off were the polls. It was they got the answer wrong, right? And that's what stands out. And this is one of the features of American politics, is that not all errors are equal, right? A 1-point error, if it's a 55 and it's really 56, nobody cares, right? But if it's a 1-point error when it's, you say 50.5 and it's really 49.5, everybody cares, right? So part of the legacy of 2016 isn't just that the polls were wrong, because they were, but it was just wrong enough to get the call wrong, right? To be over that magic number of 50 that creates the differences. And that's my main takeaway on accuracy on this, is that winning and losing colors everything, right? When we think about the accuracy of the polls, and I'm going to give you bad news about 2024 in a second here, right? When we think about the accuracy of the polls, nobody really cares about how many points off it was. They care if you get the leader wrong, right? Who's ahead. And it just so happens that the last 2 cycles have been razor thin, right? Super thin. The polls were off in 2012 as well, right? Obama re-election. If you look at the polls right before the election, they look stunningly like the polls we have right now, right? The polls for the week before the election in 2012 ranged from Obama up to Romney up to, right? Obama won fairly handily in 2012. We don't remember the great polling error of 2012, though, because generally speaking, the polls were Obama was going to win, and he did. We remember the great polling error of 2016. In part, it was a bigger error, but also it was because they got the answer wrong. State polls tend to be more variable than national polls, right? State polls tend to be more variable, in part because there's more pollsters. Iowa State we're not doing any polls of this, but we have in the past. The University of Iowa has dropped a poll every now and then. Lots of colleges and universities drop 1 poll for their state. And so we just get a lot more. And we get a lot more variability in the professionalism of the polls. Gallup, YouGov, New York Times, Siena, these are high-end professional shops. When I've done polling for the last 2 caucus cycles, we contracted with a firm. We hired experts to do it. In 2016 and 2012, we did it ourselves. It was a way less professional shop. I mean, just frankly, it was, right? Because we were building everything from scratch for 1 poll, as opposed to building an industry model around how we're going to do it. So states tend to be a lot more variable for that. Yeah, I'll come back to that in a second. I'm going a little slower than I wanted. So one of the other things that have come out of this is, all right, polls are variable. Polls are all over the place. Every poll has some inaccuracies. What if we average them all, right? So political scientists have been doing this for a long time. Academics have been doing poll averaging since the 1980s. This became really popular with Nate Silver and 538, particularly in 2012. The basic idea is, if every poll has some error, if every poll has some variability, what if we just sort of pool them? And in pooling them, we find the signal from the noise. Maybe that will do better. Part of the problem is that most polling averages that are out there, including Nate Silver's, are not transparent in how they do it. Yep, I have no idea how. Literally, Nate Silver does not release how he does it. It's a black box. I trust him. I think he does a pretty good job usually, but we can't critique it as a model, which is what it is, right? He's modeling these sorts of things, and we can't critique it because we can't see under the hood. They are usually better than individual polls, but they're not perfect. Because one of the things we've learned is that, I said we calculate a margin of error in our polls. We have an estimate that is our best estimate, and then we use a margin of error to say we're 95% sure it's within X number of points of that. The math behind the margin of error starts with the central limit theorem. That's where it comes from, is the math and stats behind that. That doesn't work anymore because we're not using random samples. And so all of these survey firms build out of their weighting a margin of error. How? No idea, right? Most of them are, again, completely opaque about it. but you can imply what it should look like. So what folks have done have said, all right, let's after the fact take all the polls. And if there's a margin of, if they all say there's a margin of error, they should follow a particular distribution around the truth. Because after the election, we know the truth, right? We know what proportion of people voted for each of the candidates. And then we can look at the polls that go around that. It ends up that the implied margin of error from the actual spread of the polls is double what the polls say, right? So every time you see a poll that says, oh, it's within 2 points on either side, think maybe it's on 4 points of either side, right? There's a lot more variability in these than we think of. And these polling averages assume the smaller variability, usually. They model the variability as part of that, and they trust the margin of errors. And one of the other things is that we are all bad at dealing with probabilities. We're just bad at it as people. Our brains don't do that very well. There's other things that can be problems, right? Late deciders can continue to be a problem. Lots of people wait until the last minute to decide how to vote. I don't understand these people personally, but they do. And if they all go in one direction, your polls are going to be wrong, right? Nobody polls the weekend before the election, right? The last set of polls usually drop the Friday before. There can also be systematic differences between those who respond and those who don't. And this was part of the problem in 2016, was that people who supported Trump were systematically less likely to take the polls. This was also part of the problem that existed in 2020, was that Democrats were more likely to take polls in 2020, mostly because in the pandemic, Democrats were more likely to be working from home. And it's not a landline thing. It's just, it's easier to answer the phone when you're working from home than when you're working in your office. So my general take is polling averages are better than individual polls. You should overestimate how uncertain they are about that. And we should just have to live with that uncertainty. We just have to be comfortable with not knowing. Now, that one way to take that is a really sort of nihilistic, then why bother, right? If we can't know. And part of the problem is the why we should bother, I think, is because the alternative is ignorance. Right? The alternative is having no idea what the heck is going on. And I find that unsatisfying. Like, I want to know. And so even a little bit of information is helpful. There are other options. Social media surveys, right? So the Twitter, you can do little polls. Donald Trump likes to promote the polls of people on Twitter. Those are awful. They're not worth the money they're printed on the internet, right? I mean, they're just absolutely worthless. There are betting markets out there now. The University of Iowa's run a betting market since the 1980s. The Iowa market used to be pretty good. These are pretty easily manipulable, and there's some evidence that they're being manipulated, that some people are placing millions of dollars of bets to be able to push the poll in a certain way to create a narrative about who's ahead. There's at least some evidence that's the case. There are other ideas about building past predictors. You may know Alan Lichtman and his keys to the White House. Those aren't great either. There's no systematic reason why that's the case. And lots of it's super subjective about what these keys are, how they count. They're super subjective. And it's also subjective what counts as a winner. So in the Lichtman model, he predicted Gore winning in 2000 and said, yep, Gore won because he won the popular vote. He predicted Trump winning in 2016 and said, yep, Trump won because he won the electoral vote. He can't have it both ways, right? And so those aren't great either. So I'll end with the what should you do, which I've already hinted at a little bit. And the main thing is to just have to sit in the uncertainty, right? We want to know, we really do, and polls are the best way to know. But when it's this close, when it's this razor thin of a margin, the polls simply can't tell us who's going to win, right? They can't tell us who's ahead, just because there's too much uncertainty, and we don't like uncertainty, right? We don't, but we sort of have to live with it. And then the other thing that I think every political scientist should tell literally everyone they talk to in the grocery store, in an Uber ride, or whatever they end up doing, is to remind everyone, we are not going to know on election night, right? I think one of the lessons from 2020 is it's going to take time to count all these. And again, I wish we would know. I wish we knew now, but we don't. That we just have to sort of live in this uncertainty, and we're going to have to, unfortunately, live in this uncertainty for several days, probably, after the election. And that's not great. right? But we have to be comfortable with that. We have to know what's coming. Otherwise, it's just going to sow chaos, right? It's just going to sow conspiracy theories, which we also are sort of hardwired to believe. It's going to sow misinformation, and it's going to do real damage to our country if we can't be comfortable with waiting to know what the right answer is. So, okay, I'll stop there. I went a little longer than I wanted. I'm sorry. I start, I go, but we'll open it for questions, right? She's bringing the mic up, so we'll wait so that everyone listening at home can hear then. I know there was a question here and a question over here, so if you could raise your hands again. Okay. Oh, she's going over here first.
So my question is, do you think that people tend to overthink political polling, or,
Yes.
are they just...
Yes, absolutely. Right. So I think people absolutely overthink polling, right? Because we don't like this uncertainty. We want to know, and in particular, I mean, let's just be honest. We want to know that our candidate's in the lead. That's what we really want to know, right? And so people who spend lots of time staring at these polls will find things, right? They'll try to hash things out, right? So they'll make claims about, oh, there's all these Republican pollsters that are flooding the zone with Republican polls to try to tilt the narrative, or they'll dig through the cross tabulations, right? So they'll look at, aha, okay, sure, this poll, but this poll only had X number of white women 18 to 35, so it's of course wrong. Right? Oh man, I mean, it's just you just can't obsess into that level. I mean, if it gives you psychic comfort for this uncertainty, I guess you can, but I'd really advise against it. People way overthink this because they're unhappy with the idea of we don't know, and we just sort of have to accept that.
You didn't, excuse me, you didn't say very much about the pollster's way of communicating with the person who's being polled. What's the tone in his voice? How is the question phrased? That sort of thing.
Sure. Most reputable pollsters work very hard to be balanced, right? Reputable pollsters, right? So a lot of them these days are taken over the web, right? So I get a question from Gallup, there's no tone of voice, right? Because I'm literally reading it on my screen, or I'm reading it in an app. The good pollsters, again, let me phrase the question this, or let me phrase the answer this way. There really are essentially two types of pollsters out there, right? There are the pollsters who make a living, that their entire business model is we can communicate to our audience what the true answer is. Right. And that's what someone like Gallup, that's what the New York Times Siena poll does. That's what Fox polling does, Fox News poll does. These are all, the Fox News poll is actually really good. I know the guy who runs it. He's an academic at the University of Texas. If anything, the Fox News poll understates Trump's support on average, but it's the Fox News poll. Anyway, their business model is we will give you, to the best of our ability, the right answer. There are a set of pollsters who are not reputable, usually, who their business model is we'll tell you what you want to hear, right? And so they will skew things. There's also a set of pollsters which are never released. Part of it is the pollsters that do that also almost never release their data or release their answers publicly. So there's also a set of pollsters who work for campaigns, right? So that the politicians, the campaigns, the candidates, the parties have their own internal pollsters that do this. And one of the things these folks do is message test. So I'm going to read you a series of following statements. I'm not even going to come up with one, right? The candidate X kicked a puppy, right? Would that make you more or less likely to vote for candidate X, right? And they ask you a string of these questions that are doing that. They don't care about the number of people voting for each candidate. That's not their goal. Their goal isn't even to persuade people, right? They're not trying, there's this idea of push polling where they try to persuade you. That's incredibly cost inefficient for campaigns, right? If a poll samples, a good poll gets like 500 to 750 people, it's expensive to do. That's an incredible waste of campaign money to try to persuade 500 people. Anyway, but what they're trying to do is test messages, right? So when Donald Trump is campaigning, he has a litany of possible messages he could use against Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris has a litany of messages, and they want to know the one that's most persuasive. And so they will say, well, what if this, what if that, what if this, right? And they are trying to push you in that. But again, they're not reporting the data for who's ahead and who's behind. And they're also not deluding themselves into thinking that data is accurate for who's ahead and behind. They're using it to see whose mind gets changed by that. But again, those are private polls. Those are not part of the public discourse about elections, which is really what I was trying to focus on.
And before somebody asks, how do you tell which is which?
Oh, yeah.
I would like to point out that we had a program a couple weeks ago about fact checking. The recording of that program is up on the library's YouTube page, and you can watch it and learn how to fact check like a pro.
I mean, the other answer I'd give to that a little bit is if you've heard of them, they're probably okay. If you haven't heard of them, they're probably not. So I know Helen over here had a question, but yeah. Wait for the mic, Helen.
You mentioned weighting.
Yeah.
And bringing either the total population, you have the total population characteristics. You want to weight relative to voters. What if that changes from previous experience? So what if, for example, you have evidence that one candidate or the other has been more effective at getting the young male voters out? Will that distort your prediction?
Yes, in two ways, right? So it'll do it in two ways. One is if you're modeling turnout and you have a model that says young men aren't going to vote, and you have a candidate that mobilizes young men, your model is not going to work. Now, if you take the Ann Seltzer Iowa poll, trust people when they're going to vote, you can fix that problem, right? The other thing it'll do, it will matter if the thing you don't wait on is connected to vote choice. So there are some things we can't vote on. We do not know how many Democrats and Republicans there are in a state. We don't, right? The census doesn't ask that question for good reason, right? People would not trust the census, and their job is not to give us the data we want. Their job is their constitutional obligation is to count every person in America. And so they don't ask questions. They don't ask questions about faith, because in the 1930s, some denominations got upset that they were asking faith questions and threatened to boycott the census, right? So they just don't ask these questions. So anyway, so if there are things that are if there are things that we cannot wait on, and again, we can't wait on party, or we shouldn't wait on party, because we don't know the correct answer, and they connect to vote choice, then we got a problem. And this is the other error in 2016, is that prior to 2016, this country was not polarized based on education very much. People with a college degree in 2012 voted for Obama and Romney at roughly the same rates as people without a college degree. And if that's the case, you don't have to worry about waiting on education, right? We don't wait on left-handedness, even if we knew that, because there's nobody who thinks lefties are more likely to left-handed as opposed to your handedness doesn't connect to your vote choice. So we could ignore that. Because again, remember, each thing you add to the complication of weights doubles the number of calculations you have to do. So in 2012, we didn't wait based on weighting, we didn't wait based on education, whether or not you have a college degree. And we did okay because education didn't predict vote choice. So we thought in 2016, we don't need to wait based on education. Trump changed that, right? One of the key features of the Trump era in American politics is a polarization based on education, right? Donald Trump caused a lot of folks, particularly white folks in this country without a college degree, to start to identify as Republicans. This isn't part of this, but people ask, how did Iowa go from voting for Obama twice to voting for Trump twice? It's because Iowa has a lot of whites without a college degree. Some of that is we have a very high proportion of whites, but the 4th district of Iowa at one point was the highest number of whites without a college degree in a congressional district in the country, right? And as we've polarized based on education, that's shifted. So whites without a college degree voted for Obama at much higher rates than they voted for Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden, right? And so they didn't wait on education in 2016, and they got it wrong. They figured that out. And so ever since 2016, any pollster worth their salt weights based on education. That doesn't mean we fixed it. There are still other problems, but that's not the problem anymore. I know there's a question here and then here. No, there's a question in the back first, right? Okay.
You wait on the gender of the candidate.
No, you don't wait on the gender of the candidate because the weight has to be of the population in the state, right? So we want, if we're doing Iowans, we want the sample to look like Iowans as opposed to weighting of the gender of the candidate creates lots of things, create other issues with polling. There's what's known as the Bradley effect, right? So the Bradley effect is named after Tom Bradley, mayoral candidate in Los Angeles, or mayor of Los Angeles, Senate candidate in California, African-American, who was running, and all the polls had a head and then didn't win. And people tried to figure out what was going on. And what ended up happening was that there were a lot of folks who weren't going to vote for him because he was Black and didn't want to say that. And this was the Giuliani's first election as mayor of New York against David Dinkins. There's a similar pattern. And we can know this because we can unpack the data, because you can look to see there's ways of unpacking it. And usually what people would end up saying is not lying, but they would say don't know. Right. I would say don't know. And then we don't count the don't knows in the who's ahead and who's behind. But a lot of people who that way. And so there is some evidence that there's a gender effect on this as well. Right. That there are some people who don't want to vote for a woman. They won't say it. If you ask them, they'll say, no, of course I will. But there is some number because it's socially unacceptable. Right. Nobody wants to say that publicly. And that's one of the things about surveys is that they're conversations. Right? Even if it's with a computer, it's still sort of a conversation. And so the rules of conversation, politeness, still leads people to give deceitful answers, right? Because they're trying to be polite. And so, yeah, the features about the candidates, their race, their gender, their race and gender potentially, can create biases in this, right? Where people are misrepresenting what they're actually going to do.
You made an interesting point, which I really caught my eye. The central limit theorem is telling us that we're going to have a normal distribution if we follow random sampling.
Yep.
Since we're not following random sampling, we no longer have a normal distribution. Right. So the distribution might be highly skewed.
Yep.
And as a result, the uncertainty of the poll is now in question if you use classical statistics.
Yes.
The statistics with moments, mean, variance.
Yep.
The kurtosis, skewness,
right.
That's what I mean by classical.
Yeah.
Has there been any attempt to use robust statistics where we're looking at percentiles and quadriles, where we don't worry so much about the shape of the distribution?
The answer is yes. Don't ask me to explain it. Yes, I mean, right. So the surveys that are doing this, right, all of them have high-end statisticians working on this problem, right? So this is one of the industries that hire stats PhDs, other than outside of academia, is that they do this. The YouGov was started by one of the early people at YouGov was a Stanford statistics political science joint faculty member. There's other firms the firm that I used for the caucus polling is a firm called Civics, which is mostly a commercial survey firm that does some political work, but I know the chief scientist there. He's a political science stats PhD, who's really, really talented, and we have a good working relationship, which is why we ended up doing this. But yeah, they do this. They spend a lot of time figuring out how to get the weighting right, but also then how to, from the statistical model that they're using for the weighting, to infer what that margin of error and that variability is going to be. And it is all stats above my head. Some of it, actually, I'll to be less modest, it's also proprietary, right? Because they don't reveal the formulas because that's how they do it, right? You don't reveal your formula for this because then your competitors, because these companies all compete, right? It's a market, can just take your formula and run with it, and they don't want that. Got to get the mic back.
So how do you figure the margin of error here? I mean, you look at this margin of error. Do I know if they assumed a normal distribution, or do I know whether they use the more, proprietary method of error?
Honestly, if you read the fine details, they'll tell you how they calculate the margin of error. They'll use language like model based, which is we have a statistical model that's behind this, that's driving it, which is the code for we're not relying on the central limit theorem and sampling theory to assume an approximation to a normal distribution, right? What that model is, don't know. But I mean, part of it is, like I said, it's a competitive market and nobody wants to give up their secrets to the competitors. But if it's really bad, the secret gets out, right? I mean, at some point, they hire from each other. And so you can't take the model with, but if it was like, well, we're just making stuff up. There actually was a pollster in 2008 that a political analyst had hired to do his own polling, who was literally making up data. Yeah, and, tens of thousands of dollars spent, and the pollster was just making stuff up. The ones that Pew is talking about here, the ones that you'll see if you go to a 538 webpage, or if you read the New York Times, or you see the Des Moines Register, or you go to any of these polling aggregators, Nate Silver, they vet, right? So there is a sort of clue to this. There's an entire academic association, the American Association of Public Opinion Research, that has an annual conference where these folks go and talk about how they're doing it and learn lessons from this. So there is, after 2016 and after 2020, they created a task force to figure out what happened, right? And so they got together and they pooled their knowledge, if not all their data, to try to figure out what happened. So we could test things, right? So if one poll has this problem and it's wrong, it overestimated Clinton support and it didn't weight based on education, well, maybe this poll over here actually did it. And if that's right, if that's the key thing, then this other poll would be right. And so they share enough information to be able to hone in on improvements, because they all have an incentive to get better, right? When nobody trusts them, right? If the companies hiring them for marketing didn't trust them, they're out of business. So they have an incentive to work together to figure out the right answer, because that builds trust in the entire industry and institutions. And so they like I said, they adapt and they change and they try to get better. So.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So it sounds like when you're talking about like all of the intersections
Yes.
of these different data points that you're using for the weighting,
Uh-huh.
like, is there a limit? Like, what if, for instance, I'm the only white male college educated female in the 5th district of Ames that answers the poll? Does that mean that my opinion gets all of the weight?
It can. That's a great question. Usually they put a limit on how big the weight can be, right? So you can't count more than, say, as 2.5 people. There was in 20, there was a tracking poll being done by the University of Southern California, and I forget who they partnered with. That was a tracking poll, and a tracking poll is regular, repeated, like daily polls or weekly polls that are really able to capture movements over time, much better than like the New York Times Siena, which does a poll once a month. You can't see the movement as much if you're doing these much more episodically. So it was a tracking poll, and it was one of these opt-in panels. So a lot of what they're doing is interviewing the same people over and over again, and they would get these huge shifts in Black support for Donald Trump. And it's because there was one guy who the shifts would happen if he clicked the link. right? So if he clicks the link, black support for Trump goes way up. If he doesn't click the link, black support for Trump, because like whatever they were doing, they were weighing this guy as like 5 people. And when you have a sample of 1,000, you have about 200 African Americans. And if this guy counts as 5, right, that's a couple of percentage points just for him by himself. Which is the other takeaway from this is when people start doing these, oh, look at black support, or look at young people support, or look at young men. The New York Times is obsessed with the Gen Z gap. Most of these are based on small numbers, right? And so there's a lot of noise. And there are surveys that are not designed to study that population, right? So New York Times is trying to survey the nation, and then they pull out a subset of it, and then they focus on that subset. Their survey, their sampling, their weighting, not designed to study that small of a population. So be very skeptical of surveys done on large populations that try to talk about subpopulations, right? So be that race, ethnicity, age, gender, and combinations of those. There are surveys out there, and this is one of the things that's going on right now. There are surveys out there that do that. So Harvard runs a giant survey of young adults, right? They only survey young adults. They get a couple of thousand young adults. They find a much smaller gender gap than what the New York Times does. And in fact, they find that young men, majority of young men are supporting Harris, which is not what the New York Times finds. There is a new survey of Latinos in America. Right, that's its job, and I know the people who run the firm. Right, the entire firm, all they do is survey Latinos. Right, and there's a market for that, and that's how they make profit. Right, they find Latino support for Harris is higher than what you'll find in these national surveys, and it's a better sample with a larger population and more targeted, and so it ends up being a little better. But these smaller, more niche surveys, well, they're not the New York Times, right? When the New York Times does a survey, I don't know if you subscribe, I subscribe to the New York Times. When they do a survey, they get a week's worth of stories out of it, right? If you read the Des Moines Register, I really respect Ann Selzer, right? I think she's wonderful. She is credited as being the best pollster in Iowa and one of the best in the country. And I think that's all fair. One of the things I absolutely love about the coverage of every time she runs a poll is, God love the Register. They put like 7 articles from one poll, right? You know, I mean, the poll probably costs, well, to guess, probably about 25 grand to run. And so they milk it for as many stories as they get, right? They get here's the story of who's ahead, right? You know, Trump's up 4, whatever it is. Here's the story of the gender breakdown. The next day, it's going to be approval of Kim Reynolds. The next day after that, it's going to be the congressional races. Then it's going to be approval of Joe Biden. And they work that data hard at the Des Moines Register. The whole point of this, because I'm on a tangent, sorry, is that these niche surveys don't have that audience. They don't have that built-in platform, right? Because they're focused on something else. Harvard's doing this young adult survey because they do it every year. And so they're academics trying to understand what young people think. They're not the New York Times, right? They're not trying to fill space in their newspaper. So.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Any questions for Professor Peterson? All right. Thank you all for coming.
Stay dry out there. So.
Yes, feel free to hang out for a little bit until the rain slacks a little bit, but I'm afraid that I am going to have to kick you out at about 1/4 till.
A week ahead, a month ahead.
It was about a month ahead, is my memory. Yeah. I mean, it was a lot. And